fill my Welcome to Speak Sex. I am your host, Eurydice, and in today's episode, our guest is Ingrid D'Aquin, or D'Aquin. Ingrid is a psychologist. She has been working with people of all ages and all walks of life her whole career. So she has. She also practices Qigong and Reiki, right? She's a wife and a mother, and her long career in psychotherapy, she has a master's degree in counseling psychology, has led her to help a lot of students and people in our community, including a number of women in the sex industry, which is what I'm interested in talking about, because we're in Miami. And so, there is kind of like an explosion of, available sex workers, because there is so much monetization, let's say, of female youth and companionship. So what Ingrid does is she gets contracted by nonprofits like Pineapple Support, and the nonprofits subsidize her fees so that the sex workers can get therapy without having to pay for it themselves. Welcome to the show, Ingrid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say that it's part of the reason why Pineapple Support came into existence is not just because the sex workers could not afford. A lot of them could afford their services. The biggest reason is because they have a difficult time even getting services in the community at large, because there's a lot of stigmatization for people in the sex industry. And it's not just for mental health services, it's for a lot of professional services, doctors, dentists, accounting. They have a hard time, for the most part, getting professional services just because of their line of work.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, which we don't realize because we think we're much more progressed than that. Yeah.
Well, and there's a lot of judgment. There's a lot of stigmatization that goes with being in the sex industry, regardless of whether or not you're an actual performer or even those who work behind the scenes. Just because you're associated to it, it can be hard for people to get professional services by virtue of that alone.
Yeah. So, my overall topic is, what does it mean to be a woman and a sex worker in 2021? How do we define sex work in the 21st century? And I think, as I mentioned, that the experience of sex workers in Miami will be pretty indicative of what's happening overall in the country. And I'm interested in, kind of revisiting a few of these cliches, prostitution is the oldest profession in history, at least in patriarchy, which, it is something that should be looked into more deeply. But yes, the patriarchy insists on paying every human female body for the sex act one way or another, right? Or supporting it financially, monetizing intimacy one way or another. And what's the place of feminism in that, in women claiming the right to make choices for themselves and to, regulate their own bodies and to be, let's say, in charge of whatever that monetization of their bodies is, and whether or not, that monetization works overall. So those are my thoughts as I enter our conversation. And I'd like to hear from you about your experience, the effect of the somatic services on women's, psyche, long term, not just in the present, youth moment, but, long term. Has feminism, helped or betrayed young women Yeah, and again, like what you find are the most common, mental difficulties or challenges for women in the sex industry?
Well, there are a lot of topics there, a lot of broad topics there.
Yes.
I don't know that I could fairly go into each one of them in its true essence. What I can speak to is my experience working with people and women in the sex industry. I could speak to actually some of the myths initially. So one of the things that was a pleasant surprise, not because I'm surprised that people in the sex industry could do these sort of things, but because of the myths that go along with it. I have to say one of the pleasant surprises was that a good 95% of the actual clients that I work with, women in the sex industry, I work with men too, by the way, have college degrees.
Wow.
Oh, but a lot of them have master's degrees.
No way.
Yes, and everything from psychology to urban planning and everything in between, economics. Some of them go into marketing. It's not, and so, and the people say to me, so what? Why are they in the sex industry if they have college degrees? I mean, what happened, right? And so that answer is actually different for everybody. Okay, just like being in the sex industry and the possible impact that would have on their physical bodies, like you were asking, or their mental health, like you were asking, is going to be very individual. Okay. Some of, and on the other question, one of the things you were asking too is what is the sex industry? What is working as a sex worker in 2020 like? Well, what's defined as sex work is very broad in 2021 compared to what it might have been even 10 years ago. Okay. A lot of my sex workers also change roles and how they practice their sex work in the sex industry also changes. So today we have camming. That wasn't a true thing 20 years ago. Okay. That's actually part of the sex industry. Now I have people who do burlesque or who do kink, the explicit nature of their work and how they do it is not overtly sexual. Right. But they're answering to a kink that is responding to a sexual desire, if you will. Okay. So they'll make content, right, that has really, from on the surface, is not explicitly sexual, but it's still part of the sex industry because you're feeding a sexual desire or want. I work for everybody who work in that area, all the way to my escorts, who, for all intents and purposes, is prostitution. It's an exchange of money for sexual favors, explicitly. Okay. And 2020 and the pandemic also had forced a lot of people in the sex industry to make some shifts and adaptations. So that hugely impacted, for example, my dancers, the strippers, right? Because in 2020, we have lockdowns and so on and so forth. They can't do that job. Now we're getting back to we're opening up, and so they can do that. So they had to make some shifts. A lot of my dancers went into camming. And there was a big learning curve because you think, oh, well, nothing difficult about that. Just get your little computer, have your internet, and then you come up with something to do online on camera. It's not that easy. And if it were, there's a whole marketing that has to go involved into it. I think another misconception that happens too is a lot of people assume that, well, if you put it on sale, you're going to have a buyer. Not necessarily. Some of my sex workers have been in the industry for a while. So a veteran, I have come to understand, is anybody who's been in the industry anywhere from 3 to 4 years. And you're thinking, that's a veteran? Well, yes.
Well, yeah, that's a long time, right?
There's a high turnover in the sex industry. Okay? I've had the privilege of working with women who've been in the sex industry for a great lot longer than 3 to 4 years. I've had clients who've been in the industry for upwards of 10, 12 years. Okay. They have a plethora of knowledge and experience when it comes to that. So I've learned a great deal from them as well. I have worked with people who they want to go into the sex industry. So it's about how do they market themselves? How do they position themselves? There's a lot more to being in the sex industry than just performing the sexual acts. It's a business. Okay. I have people who are in the sex industry who are cameras, create content. That's another aspect of it now that's very new, relatively speaking, where people in the sex industry don't necessarily have to go put themselves out there to where there's a physical contact. They can do the camming, but there's also they can create their own content. They can make their own videos. It's much more accessible because of the advent of technology. People
right.
can feel
and globalization, like you could have clients all over the world. Yeah.
Correct. And so you have a lot of women now who've gone from zero to they are at the top in their industry because they've treated it systematically from a business point of view. Mm-hmm. Right. So that requires a tremendous amount of work, of focus, of decision making, a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes when you are, for example, are a client, you're going to be consuming this content, go on fans only, and you see a video. There's a lot more behind it that you might not necessarily realize. Okay. So as a therapist working with these individuals, there is a lot more to the sex industry, I think, today than maybe there might have been before, simply because in the modern age, we have access to a lot more things, and so there are a lot more possibilities. Okay.
Right. And do you think that means like more women go into it, percentage-wise, generally, very generally speaking, than did when it was just basically the option of, bodily contact?
Well, from what I can tell, and I don't know if I can, accurately state the statistics around this because I haven't collected that data. But from my experience, yeah, I have a lot more women clients than I do men clients. And it does seem to be that the sex industry is predominantly serviced by women. That said, we are now, with the advent of technology, there are many more people who can share their kinks and their preferences and so on and so forth that might not have been in the public eye or as obvious as before. So I think it's a lot easier, for example, for say transgenders to find people of the like, okay, so that they want to consume pornography, or if they want to consume products from the sex industry, they can find likes of themselves in image, right, that maybe they might not have been able to before. So that has changed, I think. That has made things more accessible for people. So yes, I think the industry, from my experience, is predominantly women. But I think with the advent of technology and different platforms, I think more people are being able to put themselves out there as sex workers and put content out there that answers to the different gender identifications, to the different sexual orientations, and to the different kinks. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, what do they come to you mostly for? So what are the most common? Again,
they
generally
come to me
speaking,
the same things as most people in the we call it vanilla world. People who are not in the sex industry. They have the same issues you and I have. The same ones: depression, anxiety, resolving issues and trauma. Life transitioning is a big piece. I'm not focused a lot on the actual diagnosis. It's not that I don't see them. I'm more interested in looking at what is the current crises and how do I help that person navigate their way out of it. So my job is to work myself out of a job. My job is to help that person figure out when something's going wrong, how do I get myself back on track if I'm derailed? Regardless of what your diagnoses are, for me, if you know how to set your boundaries and how to identify them and enforce them, you gotta get out of jail free card, as far as I'm concerned, because that will help you, if more than anything else, get yourself centered. So whether you've got anxiety or depression. So not that I'm saying you don't address those, of course you do, but you're always going to see anxiety. You're always going to see depression. Anybody who lands on this planet at one point or another is probably going to experience anxiety and is probably going to experience some form of depression. So the common colds, what I call the common colds of mental health. It's what happens when they do. It's what is the root cause of that anxiety or that depression, and what you do about it that matters.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. What I do find is people in the sex industry likely are going to have a form of depression and anxiety that they've been dealing with for a lot longer, unaddressed. That I see a lot in the sex industry. That's where you end up having mental health problems that get exacerbated over time.
Yeah.
Because they're being addressed.
Yeah, and it's possible that they go into the sex work in order to find, quick fulfillment, approval. So fulfillment not in a profound way, but approval for who they are. Because when you're growing up with some of these difficulties, I think a lot of it comes from a lack of stability, focus, love from the home, support, kind of like unequivocal support. So when, and you're young, and that's when you're most coveted physically, right? So all of a sudden you can get that support outside, and it becomes an incentive, along with the money. I think it becomes a big incentive, compliments and flattery and the sense of empowerment, however brief, right? So, and I think that, like normative males are all socialized to assume that they will have to pay for their, sexual satisfaction. And so, women, again, normative women, we're talking, I'm generalizing a lot, have a kind of like split, let's say, between their embodied pleasure and like their mental understanding of it. So our minds are more male in a sense, masculine in a sense, because they are formed by the patriarchy. So we tend to see our bodies and objectify them ourselves, and I feel that that's something that sex work just inevitably will exacerbate by means of repetition. But other than that, yeah, I think that what you said about boundaries, it's just the lack of clear intention, and as we function, because our boundaries will keep changing, right?
Yeah, of course. Right. That's the idea, is that as you grow and evolve as a human being, right, so too do your boundaries, because your sense of self shifts,
changes, yeah,
and changes, right, as you grow. There's a core, there's an essence that is pervasive, that stays true through the course of the human's life. I can't say for all women, but most women that I know that I've spoken to, even as we carry our children, we can sense the difference in temperament.
Oh, yeah.
In our bellies, even before that child is even born, we sense the difference between one child and another.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That temperament, when it comes forth at birth, we have some babies, they're just chilled out. They take the boob, you burp them, they go to sleep, not a problem. And then the others, they're so damn pain in the ass, they won't go to sleep. One feeding goes into the other, and say, Jesus Christ, like, is this what I signed up for? I didn't sign up for that. But there you go. There's that kid, right? They come with, I'm not a Skinner person, tabula rasa, where they, you have a blank slate. Yeah, it's it's not a blank slate. Humans don't show up with just nothing. Exactly. They come with a temperament, right? You have children who are more malleable than others. There are others who, they're just more difficult in terms of their temperaments and personality develops over time. Yes, nurture versus nature. I'm not going to get into that debate. I have my own theory on that one, but there's no scientific evidence to support except for my own experiences. But yes, people come with their own temperaments, and yes, boundaries should change over the course of time because it has to do in large part with your identity. There are things that you are tolerate and accept at 40 that in a million years you wouldn't have tolerated or accepted when you were 20.
That's right. Yeah.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
Okay. So that has a lot to do with your personal boundaries. Sometimes our boundaries go the opposite direction, where instead of being in a place where you feel that you're more autonomous, you have direction in your life and you know how to manage that and so on. Sometimes we revert. We lose some of our freedoms in our time. Maybe through experience or choices or decisions or circumstances. That does happen as well. Sometimes we're thrusted into circumstances where we're in survival mode and we have to lower our standards. So that's a shift in boundaries, right? So yes, boundaries do change and they're supposed to.
Yeah. And I personally, I'm a believer that identity changes too. And that, unfortunately, we live in a strange moment where that's not like taken for granted. So it's like my identity is XYZ, which, yes, I'm sure it is right now. But like everyone I know, everyone I know. And like you have known a lot of people, in the span of like 20, 30, 40 years. Their sense of identity changes, partly because of the relationships they're in, of all kinds of relationships that they're in as humans, the pack that they travel in.
Of course.
So they identify differently, both sexually and socially, sometimes religiously, like ethnically, you name it. It's just, and I feel that, it's a disservice to us right now that we're so into this, identity wars, which presumes that we have one identity, for life. And as someone who, was raised in one culture and then lived in two different cultures and, deeply embedded in their different religions and laws and mores, right? I just see firsthand how it's arbitrary in a sense. It's all man-made, culture. Like we make culture, and we can shift our identity, cultural identity, as we grow. So and I think that it's very useful to us to understand that our identity and our boundaries change, because then, we self-judge less, right? Like we don't have this sense that I'm betraying my identity or my standards or my rules, because that could instead be I am changing, right? I'm updating my operational system.
The more you are exposed to different people and ideas and religions and cultures, I find that, I don't know if it's me or if I'm more sensitive to it, because as a therapist, like I said, I see people from all walks of life and careers. And my job is not to be in a place of judgment. My job is to hear why the person is in distress, why they're in my office, okay, and help them to, through their own value system and boundaries, curate a life that they are not in distress living. Okay. There's another piece that I think is also important for not just for therapists who work with people in the sex industry, but for humans at large, right? One of the things that, it's drummed into our heads where we're doing our training is meet the client where they're at. Okay. But the understanding behind that is meet their client where they're at so that you can get them to gain the insight that they're seeking, so that from there they can make the changes that they want to make. That makes sense, right? Okay. So you work with a client and they're struggling being able to gain the insight to see that some of the choices that they're making or the emotional response that they're having is what's holding them back, et cetera, et cetera. So you think, oh my God, once they have the insight, you're home free. Yay. Now you can do the change. That bit me in the ass. Because there was one particular client who would, and this was a sex worker. She was struggling with the fact that she found that her clients were not respecting her and seeing her and valuing her as the woman that she is. And she found that everything was very transactional, and everything was, what could they get the most out of her for the least amount of money? And it was a struggle for her. She's like, and at one point she says to me, and so now she's trying to work through this, right? But a lot of her money-making clients, the ones that would be her ideal client, were also ideologically and politically diametrically opposed to her.
Yeah, right. That happens.
And so she was struggling with, how do I do this? How do I stay authentic to myself and still do my job? And so at one point, she said to me, I don't know how to do this without objectifying these men. I said, bingo. That's the point.
Yeah, you got to objectify them because they're objectifying you.
Right. So her thing was, I had met the client where she was at. She understood the insight she needed. She understood until she was able to actually say that piece. And so I swear to you, I was on my little Juliet balcony and I'm sitting there like, dear God, how do I help this person? How do I help this client? I mean, I've met them where they're at. They have the insight. Like, how do we get past this, right? And that's when I understood. Yes, meet the client where they're at. Yes, you can lead the horse to water. They get the insight. But to cross the threshold was not necessarily the point of my job. You have to be able to accept that the client may get the insight. They have every right to shelve that information until such time as that they are either emotionally, psychologically, mentally, or situationally ready and prepared to do something about that insight. That's meeting the client where they're at. That's what bit me in the ass.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. Yeah.
So I have a lot of my sex workers who they come in, and what they want to do is they're in a transitionary phase. They want to work themselves out of the sex industry. They want to do something else. There are insights they need to gain about that. But even when they get it, making that decision, that leap, they don't always do it at that moment. That's one of the most critical things I think I could share as a therapist to other people who work with people in the sex industry and even in the vanilla world. But it was amplified in my work with people in the sex industry, because a lot of them do come and they work through things and they get they show up for their work. And I realized, and this is part of what I think has helped me be maybe a little bit more effective with some of my clients in the sex industry, is like, you got the insight, but it's your choice when you decide to see it through, to do something about it. And that's okay. 9 times out of 10, if I say to somebody, what do you want? And I'll pose exactly that question to my clients. It sounds like a pretty simple damn question, doesn't it? What do you want? But it's not.
It's not, yeah. No, it's not.
People draw blanks. Like, what do you mean? What do I want? What do you mean? Like, it wasn't a trick question. I used simple words. What do you want?
Yeah.
It's hard to define that.
Well, because I think like where we get money is different from where we get social respect, and even though it shouldn't be. And then, of course, like what is, love and safety, emotional, right? Love and safety, that's another part of it. And for sure, that's different too. But like, let's say you're a stripper, and that's common for so many of our jobs as women. You make so much more, but you don't have like the social respect that you would have if you were even like, a dental assistant, right? A technician.
Correct.
So like, and being a mother gets us no respect socially. It's like, and but what do you do for a living, right? So we've got everything again. That's like the muddleness where, do you make a choice based on what will make you most money? Do you make a choice based on what society, our values will approve of most? Do you want to be dependent, independent? It's and it's hard. It's really hard to kind of figure out which satisfies us most, because in a way we would like a little bit of everything, to be independent or interdependent, and to be financially safe, and to be respected for who we are, and what we do. And I think like with women's lib, all of that became muddled and compartmentalized.
Yeah, it did. It absolutely did. And this is, and you're sort of like, again, I know I sound like a broken record. I'm just so passionate about it. You're kind of supporting exactly that idea, which is that muddledness, that confusion, that trying to decide what the priority is going to be and how how you're going to navigate this. What are the choices that are going to be made? This is why centering back on the self. How are you going to interact with the world? What's important for you right now? You get to decide that. And that usually is one of those moments where my clients go, what the fuck? What do you mean I get to decide that? I thought this was I'm doing, I have to do. No, you get to decide that. Just knowing that you have the permission to do so. Look, not making a decision, staying stuck in where you're at is hard. And doing the shifts and setting the boundaries and figuring out where you're going to say yes or no in your life and to whom you're going to say yes or no, including yourself, is hard. Well, then pick your heart. You know the results of that.
Right. You're here because of it.
Right.
Yeah.
So going back to that muddledness, that confusion, that wanting to weigh out the different things there, but how do you make that happen? That's why the work in doing the boundary work is so incredibly important. Because you get then to decide in that moment. And what I endeavor to get my clients to understand is you don't have to ask anybody for permission. Not the idea of what you think you should or could be, not what society's deciding has to be, what your husband wants you to be, what your mom is disappointed you did not become. And it's actually a very terrifying process.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of pushing. There's a lot of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back in that process, because it is actually very terrifying to have that freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom is expensive.
Yeah.
But it's mostly expensive up here.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, I agree. Yeah, I agree.
It is. And working through that and towards that is an incredibly difficult journey for anybody. But I do find that my clients who are in the sex industry, who are trying to hang on to the vestiges of a self that they want to actualize, can be a terrifying process. Just knowing that they have permission to do it can be a terrifying thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was recently listening to a documentary of a young woman who defected from North Korea and her process of doing so, as from child to adult, and how her whole story. And one of the things that struck me the most, that it echoed again what I see even in my sex workers, is, at one point in her ordeal, she was asked, at one point she said, I actually wanted to go back to North Korea. And her interviewer said to her, why in the world would you want to do that? And she said, because freedom was terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't know how to handle it. And it kind of brings me to one of the things what I call the responsibility equation, which I work with all of my clients, which is we take responsibility. We're taught, oh, you have to be responsible. You have to be responsible. What the fuck exactly is that supposed to mean? It means that you need to take on a burden. But as an adult, you get to choose what burdens you're going to shoulder. But when you do decide to shoulder, when you finally understand that if you shoulder a burden, you then are taking on the power to make choices and decisions around that burden. When you have the power to make a choice, to make a decision, then you have freedom. Responsibility equals freedom. When you understand that when you take responsibility for something, you're buying part of your freedom, then you start to choose your responsibilities wisely.
Yeah, understanding that, I think, is very useful. Yeah.
That's a hard process.
It's very hard, yeah, because we kind
Which
of like
I'm still in the process of
on automatic. We're like,
no, exactly.
Yeah.
And some people, you'll find it for some people, they conquer the world, the CEOs of companies and so on and so forth. Surprised to find that this is the same person who can't make a decision about what shoes to wear because their wife decided that for them.
Oh, yeah. I think that really wealthy people have less freedom than most of us. And I think that the top as well as, the lower, but mostly, the very wealthy have very little freedom. And they don't understand it because they're caught in that endless cycle, right? Of like their whirlwind of competitions and contests and acquisitions and hoarding. But like when we look at them from the outside, I just feel compassion, I feel bad because it's like, where is the human in there? There is no time or space for, for that choice to be free. Like, and I love the way that I love that you say buy freedom, because that's very true. We have to, our freedom has to be bought and earned. And
it has to be, whether it's money or otherwise.
Right. And what else? Like I've always thought, what else is money for, if not to buy freedom? Yeah.
Money is actually value neutral. Money doesn't hold any value other than what we assign to it.
Right. Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
There was a documentary that was made, I want to say over 10 years ago. It's called Happy. Okay. So the study of happiness and what makes happiness is not something that was in the forefront of psychology up until maybe about 20, 30 years ago. No one seriously studied happiness and what makes you happy. So this documentary sort of attempted to point that out. But one of the data that came out of that really stuck with me is that if you're going to take within the context of like the modern industrialized world, so Europe and North and South America, if you were to take the average family, say of 4, anything above $70,000 does not buy you happiness. Why? Because the basic needs are met. So if you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so at the bottom of that pyramid, it's your, food and shelter, so safety and so on. If you've got that and you've got a little bit more so you can have your education, you have enough monetary support to then get to the pinnacle of that pyramid, that hierarchy of needs, to self-actualization. So money can't buy you happiness, but it's a good damn down payment. You need the down payment.
Right, yeah. You need the down payment.
Nobody thinks about their souls when they're figuring they need to eat or they're going to be eaten by the bear.
Yeah.
Fuck self-actualization.
You need the down payment.
But once you've done that and you've afforded yourself enough in the world that you're safe, you can grow, you have an education, then you can hit that pinnacle, right? But money in and of itself is neither good nor bad. That's actually another big piece. A lot of work that I do with a lot of my sex work clients, and I actually did for Pineapple Support, I did a webinar on Financial Freedom 101, right? Because that's another thing that I find, that regardless of what part of society you are, we're not educating our
no, we have no financial literacy at all.
At all.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah.
Right? So that's another piece to it. So what's the point of all that? Working with my clients and shifting their relationship to money is another big piece of the work that I do. And that tends to come up time and time again with my clients in the sex industry, because their work is very transactional when it comes to their personal selves and their body and their sex and money. Right? So working through their relationship with money is another big piece of the work that I do with my clients. Right? Because a lot of us show up to the party having a very negative view of money. And we assign negative attributes to people who have a lot of money, or who hoard it, or who don't have a lot of money, right? So you have to revisit a lot of your own personal morality around money. And part of what holds back a lot of my sex workers is the fact that they're charging money for their services. But so does everybody else.
Yeah.
Money's not the root of all evil. It's your emotions behind it. Money is value neutral.
Greed is the root of a lot of evil, but that's not money. It's kind of a, compulsive, or the compulsive, the compulsion to make money non-stop, from when you start work until basically you die doing it. And that's something that's unhealthy. And I think our society kind of pushes us in those directions with all the consumption that it, incentivizes us to do. So the more we spend, the less we have, the more we need to make in order to keep, right? So we stay in that addictive feed for money. So yeah, after, I love what you said, 75,000 or whatever that number is. It's a symbolic number of, safety. You don't have to go to bed thinking, are we gonna eat or have shelter, right, tomorrow? So whatever that is, depending on where you are. And yeah, I think that's just a very, ultimate kind of place for, revisiting, right, to take a moment and look at your situation and make your choices. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, if we're going to stay focused on just the people in the sex industry, let's be very clear. We're exchanging the data or the exposure or the access to sexual content or contact experiences that are designed to elicit a sexual response on the person who's actually paying for it, right? It is transactional in nature. But there's a distinction to be made between our relationship to that, or say my client's relationship to that, and their personal relationship to money. And if you are going into your job with the idea that you're exchanging something of the sexual nature for money, and you view money as bad, what do you think that's going to do to you in your job performance and in your ability to be financially independent or free or solid? It's going to wreak havoc in all kinds of ways. Yeah. Because shame, there's guilt, there's anger, there's all kinds of stuff that gets associated to that from a monetary point of view. That requires healing. It does. It requires a shifting of mindset and healing of whatever your story behind those emotions are.
Right. And then there is the bigger picture, which we're not going to get into, of, where most of money is gathered now and why, and who gets to have the money to pay, and who doesn't, so has to work for it more. So, and that's just definitely, from in my point of view, a societal injustice that, has to be addressed. Because I feel that at the end of one's lifetime, right, we should start over again. and rather than, accumulate, like, the generational wealth, I think is one of our ills, one of our injustices. But since, our birth is just an accident, like I happen to be born to X parent or Y parent, and we should be starting more or less, evenly as we embark upon our work lives. But yeah, I do think that what you're saying is important to keep remembering. Money has no value and no moral aspect to it. It's just a form of energy, and it's man-made. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm good, Ingrid. If you are,
I'm good too.
Yeah. I loved our hour, and thank you for your advice and your wisdom. I think that was like a mini therapy session for our listeners.
You're very, very welcome. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure. Yeah, and I learned a lot.
So please, you know what? I actually have one of my clients. I was like, I have to do a podcast. She goes, send me, is it live or send me the link? So send me the link if that's okay.
Yeah,
so I can share with my
clients.
Some of my clients want to hear it. I said, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And everybody out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us every week. And until next week, keep speaking sex. If I could make love incessantly, I would be God.